public opinion. Just finished chapter 1, and like, holy shit, am I excited to keep reading. He's addressing all of these things that I have thought about, and he is putting statements down that will help provide clarity in my thinking. So I would love to get these notes into my journal, write them down, become really familiar with them. But for now, I'm going to recap. I already talked about the first 2 pages a little bit, but just a quick summary, right? We were talking about how the preface to this has to do with Plato's allegory of the cave, right? And that they begin the book, Lippmann begins this book by providing this example of an island in 1914 where Englishmen, Frenchmen, and Germans lived, right? And sort of that the reality of the world, the belief that the world as known was the world as it was. And then that great example of, they started for the Indies and found America. They diagnosed evil and hanged old women. They thought they could grow rich by always selling and never buying. A caliph, obeying what he conceived to be the will of Allah, burned the library at Alexandria. That great example being the irony of that last example being wrong, and that Julius Caesar is actually the one that burned down Alexandria, but still reinforces the argument being made there. And to me, and adding on to that a little bit, to me indicates the truth of the subject matter, that even if the facts of that sentence don't work out, it is still true. That is crazy. So going on, continuing on then, talked about how great men, even during their lifetime, are usually known to the public only through a fictitious personality. And that's sort of where I left off, was with that. So what he does here is he then takes it from the individual and then kind of breaks it open into the larger societal dynamic. And so expanding on this, fictitious personality, the 2 versions of the self, gets into an example of, Jean de Perifeu, who saw hero worship at first hand. He was an officer on Joffre's staff at the moment of that soldier's greatest fame. For 2 years, the entire world paid almost divine homage to the victor of the Main. Every territory sent its specialty. The painter sent his picture, the sculptor his statuette, to the dear old lady a comforter or socks. The shepherd in his hut carved a pipe for his sake, right? This hero worship. Thousands of little children, without their parents' knowledge, took pen in hand and wrote to tell him their love. Most of them called him our Father. And there was a poignancy about their effusions, their adoration, these sighs of deliverance that escaped from thousands of hearts at the defeat of barbarism. To all of these naive little souls, Joffrey seemed like St. George crushing the dragon. Right? So then he goes on to say, lunatics, simpletons, the half-crazy and the crazy turned their darkened brains towards him as toward reason itself. This ideal Joffrey was compounded out of the victory won by him, his staff, and his troops. the despair of the war, the personal sorrows, and the hope of future victory. But beside hero worship, there is the exorcism of devils. By the same mechanism through which heroes are incarnated, devils are made. If everything good was to come from Joffrey, Foch, Wilson, or Roosevelt, everything evil originated in the Kaiser Wilhelm, Lenin, and Trotsky. They were as omnipotent for evil as the heroes were omnipotent for good. To many simple and frightened minds, there was no political reverse, no strike, no obstruction, no mysterious death or mysterious conflagration anywhere in the world of which the causes did not wind back to these personal sources of evil. So that's a really interesting dynamic there. Like, and it's similar. And one of the things that I want to capture about U.S. and we'll get into this later, but public opinion, U.S. public opinion, the hero worship of these people, and right, just in the same mechanism, in the same kind of machine that elevates these heroes, creates the evil. And similar, like Marxism, right, this, communism being bad because it's been supported by bad, these evil people. So worldwide concentration of this kind on a symbolic personality is rare enough to be clearly remarkable, and every author has a weakness for the striking and irrefutable example. In a more normal public life, symbolic pictures are no less governant of behavior, but each symbol is far less inclusive because there are so many competing ones. Not only is each symbol charged with less feeling because at most it represents only a part of the population, but even within that part, there is infinitely less suppression of individual difference. The symbols of public opinion in times of moderate security are subject to check and comparison and argument. They come and go, coalesce, and are forgotten, never organizing perfectly the emotion of the whole group. It occurs in those middle phases of a war when fear, pugnancy, and hatred have secured complete dominion of the spirit, either to crush every other instinct or to enlist it, and before weariness is felt. At almost all other times, and even in war when it is deadlocked, a sufficiently greater range of feelings is aroused to establish conflict, choice, hesitation, and compromise. And I noted here that I was thinking about this idea of words or concepts, meaning the meaning of words or concepts to individuals over time. For example, if you're born at X period, if you're born in the 1920s, freedom looks like Y. It looks like this, and that's different than someone who was born in 1996, right? But you are taught it in this same capacity that whatever your experience in that moment is your understanding of freedom. And so I argue that over time, the U.S. we are less free, oppressingly less free, but we were born at different times, but our definition of the world around us and the idea of freedom, although in reality is radically different than its original meaning, or understanding or experience, we can't decipher that. We can't know that because we aren't in that moment. So, and that's something that he addresses. So I'm loving this right now. And think then of how within each nation the symbolic picture of itself frayed. Okay, so then after, following the war, right? They had this during the war. They had these symbolic pictures of each country: Britain, the defender of public law; France, watching at the frontier of freedom; America, the crusader. And then think of how within each nation the symbolic picture of itself frayed out as party and class conflict and personal ambition began to stir postponed issues. And then of how the symbolic pictures of the leaders gave way as one by one Wilson, Clemenceau, Lloyd George ceased to be the incarnation of human hope and became merely the negotiators and administrators for a disillusioned world. Our first concern with fictions and symbols is to forget their value to the existing social order and to think of them simply as an important part of the machinery of human communication. This is critical. We're getting into these gaps in my understanding that are really important. So the issue of this like hero worship and good versus evil and these conflicts, right, is they're based on fictions and symbols. And so you need to see them for what they are, which is just machinery of human communication, propaganda. The same people who were the leaders of, America the Crusader became negotiators and administrators for a disillusioned world. So another way of seeing this is like during the wartime, and this is kind of what they get to, where like you almost can't exist without war, or why peace is so hard. It's because when there's no war to be fought and no symbolic meaning to be supporting or, aligning yourself with, then that quickly deteriorates into these lower tier conflicts, the class conflicts, insurance companies and corporations and things like that. And so it's important to recognize these things for what they are: forms of communication, interpretation of the moment. So pictures of French and German soldiers. Miss Sherwin of Gopher Prairie is aware that a war is raging in France and tries to conceive it. She has never been to France, and certainly she has never been along what is now the battlefront. Pictures of French and German soldiers she has seen, but it is impossible for her to imagine 3 million men. Go on. But Miss Sherwin has no access to the order of battle maps. And so if she is to think about the war, she fastens upon Joffrey and the Kaiser as if they were engaged in a personal duel. At that moment, I was thinking about an example from this recent trip to Minnesota for Christmas. My mom was talking about, Trump and his supporters and things like that, where unable to perceive the reality of the grand nature of all of this, she fixates on it as this personal duel between them and kind of makes her interpretation based off of that personal duel. And then goes into an example of, there was a photographer's visit to Joffrey. The general was in the office and they were going to take a picture. They noticed there were no maps on the walls. But since according to popular ideas, it is not possible to think of a general without maps, a few were placed in position for the picture and removed soon after. That's similar to that iconic picture in American history of the soldiers planting the flag after, I think, World War II. Like, that was a staged photo. It didn't happen organically, and it's to help this symbolism in public opinion. The only feeling that anyone can have about an event he does not have experience is the feeling aroused by his mental image of that event. That is why until we know what others think they know, we cannot truly understand their acts. And then goes into, I've seen a young girl. The a gust of wind cracked the kitchen window. For hours, she was inconsolable. But when she was able to talk, it transpired that if a window pane broke, it meant that a close relative had died. She was therefore mourning for her father, who had frightened her into running away from home. The father was, of course, quite thoroughly alive, as a telegraph inquiry soon proved. But until the telegram came, the cracked glass was an authentic message to that girl. And so I'm going to circle back here. I noted on that idea that the only feeling that anyone can have about an event is based on the mental image of that event. And I noted aphantasia there, and I keep coming back to this. I keep bringing it up, but I do wonder if my inability to visualize makes me less susceptible to the symbolism and propaganda, which allows me to kind of cut through the bullshit and decipher what is true and false a little bit better. Who knows? So abnormality in these instances is only a matter of degree. Let him cast the first stone who did not believe in the Russian army that passed through England in August 1914, did not accept any tale of atrocities without direct proof, and never saw a plot, a traitor, or a spy where there was none. Let him cast a stone who never passed on as the real inside truth what he had heard someone say who knew more than he did. I thought those lines were particularly interesting in today's landscape, particularly like Trump's people. It's on both sides right now, but Trump's people are notorious for this. And it kind of has to do with this like burden of proof and how hard it can be to change someone's perspective. And so, the person who didn't believe the Russian army passed through England in 1914 didn't accept any of the tales of the atrocities without any direct proof. Show me the proof. But if the role was reversed and they believed that, they would believe those facts way quicker. In all of these instances, we must note particularly one common factor. It is the insertion between man and his environment of a pseudo-environment. Pseudo-environment is really interesting to me right now. To that pseudo-environment, his behavior is a response. But because it is a behavior, the consequences, if they are acts, operate not in the pseudo-environment where the behavior is stimulated, where the decision to make that action is derived, but the real environment where the action eventuates. So if the behavior is not a practical act, but what we call roughly thought and emotion, it may be a long time before there is any noticeable break in the texture of the fictitious world. But when the stimulus of the pseudo-fact results in action on things or other people, contradiction soon develops. Then comes the sensation of butting one's head against a stone wall, of learning by experience. I love that line. And witnessing Herbert Spencer's tragedy of the murder of a beautiful theory by a gang of brutal facts, the discomfort in short of a maladjustment. I noted on this pseudo-environment thing, this current event example of Luigi Mangione, the killing of the United Health CEO. Which I think is fair here. But it is certainly the case that his pseudo-environment directed his action, which transpired in the real environment. Now, interestingly, it's what's the result might be is that the pseudo-environment that he was operating off of is likely that environment for a majority of people and will become, and part of the reason why I believe he will be remembered as a hero is because he will be breaking down the barrier of that pseudo environment and turning it into reality that everyone is conscious of. The analyst of public opinion must begin then by recognizing the triangular relationship between the scene of action, the human picture of that scene, and the human response to that picture working itself out upon the scene of action. I think that that's really a concise way of understanding what, if you are assessing public opinion, you have to recognize the triangular relationship between the scene of action, the event that occurred, the human picture of that scene, sort of the larger picture in humanity, the history, the current experience, etc., and then the human response to that picture working itself out. Kind of how people are interplaying with that and whatever. And so they get into this example of the scene played out in the United States Senate. Or let me continue on after that quote. It is like a play suggested to the actors by their own experience, in which the plot is transacted in the real lives of the actors and not merely in their stage parts. The two men are quarreling ostensibly about some money. Their passion is inexplicable. And then the picture fades out, and what one or the other of these two men sees with their mind's eye is reenacted. And then the exterior drama is explained. The hero is not greedy. The hero is in love. A scene not so different was played out in the United States Senate. At breakfast on the morning of September 29th, 1919, some of the senators read a news dispatch in the Washington Post about the landing of American Marines in the Dalmatian coast. The newspaper said, "Facts now established. The following important facts appear already established. The orders to the Rear Admiral Andrews, commanding the American naval forces in the Adriatic, came from the British Admiralty via the War Council and Rear Admiral Knapp's in London. The approval or disapproval of the American Navy Department was not asked. Without Daniels' knowledge, Mr. Daniels was admittedly placed in a peculiar position when cables reached here, stating that the forces over which he is presumed to have exclusive control were carrying on what amounted to naval warfare without his knowledge." And then goes on to say, basically that acting on behalf of Great Britain, it was further realized that, and this part is from Lippmann, under the new League of Nations plan, foreigners would be in a position to direct American naval forces in emergencies, end of Lippmann, with or without the consent of American Navy Department. So it goes on to explain what transpired in the Senate. First senator comment is Mr. Knox. Indignantly, he demands investigation. Mr. Brandegee of Connecticut, who spoke next, indignation has already stimulated credulity, where Mr. Knox indignantly wishes to know if the report is true. Mr. Brandegee, a half a minute later, would like to know what would have happened if Marines had been killed. Mr. Knox, interested in the question, forgets that he asked for an inquiry and replies. If American Marines had been killed, it would be war. The mood of the debate is still conditional. Debate proceeds. McCormick of Illinois, talks about, repeats Theodore Roosevelt's quip about waging peace. More debate. Mr. Bandigee notes that the Marines acted under orders of a Supreme Council sitting somewhere but cannot recall who represents the United States on that body. The Supreme Council is unknown to the Constitution of the United States. Therefore, Mr. New of Indiana submits a resolution calling for the facts. So far, at that point, they're still recognized vaguely that they are discussing a rumor. But then it goes on. Emotionally, right, being lawyers, they still remember some of the forms of evidence, but as red-blooded men, they already experience all the indignation which is appropriate to the fact that American Marines have been ordered into war by a foreign government and without the consent of Congress. Emotionally, they want to believe it because they are Republicans fighting the League of Nations. This arouses the Democratic leader, Mr. Hitchcock. He defends the Supreme Council. It was acting under the war powers. Peace has not been concluded because the Republicans are delaying it. Therefore, action was necessary and legal. Both sides now assume that the report is true, and the conclusions they draw are the conclusions of their partisanship. Yet this extraordinary assumption is in a debate over a resolution to investigate the truth of the assumption. It reveals how difficult it is, even for trained lawyers, to suspend response until the returns are in. The response is instantaneous. The fiction is taken for truth because the fiction is badly needed. So there's a lot to break down there, but this is something we see constantly today, where the real issue gets sidestepped by these distractions that come up. What if a Marine had been killed, right? They're speculating on speculation. It was not, and this goes on to explain that the picture of the scene in their heads was totally furnished, right? And in this case, probably with intent to deceive, by a man who cared nothing about the Adriatic, but much about defeating the League, as in the League of Nations. To this picture, the Senate responded by a strengthening of its partisan differences over the League. And then it turns out that the whole scenario wasn't even true. That they jumped to that conclusion, and it was proven that no, instead, the Italian army asked Americans to come and support them and defend them and help them, and that the Italian government thanked them for their assistance. And so nobody attacked, there was none of this malicious stuff. And so they spent this whole time debating this thing and strengthening this partisan divide. And it was largely, based on this picture that was meant to deceive, strictly for the goal, for other aims. So they took this real example and used it to fuel a fight on a completely irrelevant subject, which was the League of Nations. So, and then he goes on to say whether this is above or below its normal standard, it doesn't really matter to decide. And, whether we operate better than other parliaments, that doesn't really matter either. I should like to think only about the worldwide spectacle of men acting upon their environment, moved by stimuli from their pseudo-environments. So people, think about, right, they determined that if this was true, it would mean war. And if they operated on that assumption, they would have started war for no reason. And so thinking about how men are acting upon their environment and moved by their pseudo environments. They live, we are likely to say, in different worlds. More accurately, they live in the same world, but they think and feel in different ones. Somehow or other, for reasons often necessarily obscure as a result of domination or compromise or a log roll, there emerge from these political bodies commands which set armies in motion or make peace, conscript life, tax, exile, imprison, protect property or confiscate it, encourage one kind of enterprise and discourage another, facilitate imagination or obstruct it, improve communication or censor it, establish schools, build navies, proclaim policies and destiny, raise economic barriers, make property or unmake it, bring one people under the rule of another, or favor one class against another. So like, they just, again, that's supposed to be there to highlight, so one, how these people are making decisions and how they're so influenced by stimuli in a moment. Right. And again, an important thing that I forgot to highlight was the inability to wait for the response. Everything seems so urgent, but it would be healthier to realize that acting in the name of urgency on certain matters can make the urgency worse. But then again, also, how those decisions are made and all of these different ways that it influences the entire world, really. And so the formal political structure exists in a social environment where there are innumerable large and small corporations and institutions, voluntary and semi-voluntary associations, national, provincial, urban, and neighborhood groupings, which often as not make the decision that the political body registers. And what are these decisions based? So to expect that all men for all time will go, and then goes on to talk about the man next door might be a Christian Scientist, and then there's who, or the Christian who may live in a fairy tale, as his neighbors would say, or the theosophist who might be a vegetarian, and a devil worshiper, right? Whether or not this sort of variety is valuable, this sort of unity is shaky. These people with super, super different backgrounds or understandings or interpretations of the world around them coming together to expect that all men for all time will go on thinking different things and yet doing the same things is doubtful speculation. That is to say, with so many different perceptions of the world and how to best operate, it's doubtful speculation to assume that they'll continue on thinking so vastly different, but then be willing to act and do the same things. So 4 men may meet under the same lamppost, one to paint it pea green as a part of a great municipal reform, one to read his breviary in the light of it, one to embrace it with accidental ardor in a fit of alcoholic enthusiasm, and the last merely because the pea green post is a conscious point of rendezvous with his young lady. But to expect this to happen night after night is unwise. For the 4 men at the lamppost, substitute the governments, the parties, the corporations, the societies, the social sets, the trades and professions, universities, sects, and nationalities of the world. Think of the legislator voting a statute that will affect distant peoples, a statesman coming to a decision. Think of the peace conference, a clergyman calling on the police to regulate amusement. 9 judges deciding whether a legislature in Oregon may fix the working hours of women. A cabinet meeting to decide on the recognition of a government. Like a boy choosing his career, a merchant estimating supply and demand for the coming season, a speculator predicting the course of the market, a banker deciding whether to put credit behind a new enterprise, the advertiser, the reader of advertisements. Think of the different sorts of Americans thinking about their notions of the British Empire or France or Russia or Mexico. It is not so different from the 4 men at the pea green lamppost. I thought that was just like, he did such a good job of painting the picture of these vastly different experiences, and there were so many more that he listed. But the context that goes around their decision making, their interpretation of the world, their understanding of it, right? And the consequences of those decisions too, right? And how do they make those decisions? As rational beings, it is worse than shallow to generalize at all about comparative behavior until there is a measurable similarity between the environments to which behavior is a response. So, talks about like there are important biological differences. So we get into this idea of nature versus nurture, right? And to generalize about behavior until there's measurable similarity between environments for which their behavior is a response, like that's important. So I think about, again, you could go back to the Luigi example. His behavior is a response to this environment that we are in. And I think many people are feeling like they are in a similar environment. And so, right? But the more to the point being, it's shallow to generalize about behavior until there's a similar enough experience in our environments. So you think about like my upbringing versus, growing up in Compton, right? It's so easy to be someone like me and be like, well, why are those guys joining these gangs, like they're born into that lifestyle and that's kind of their only way to survive. And so until the baseline of our experiences are similar, measurably similar, it's pretty shallow to generalize behavior. To my mind, it shows the uselessness of pontificating about what man is and always will be from what we observe man to be doing, or about what are the necessary conditions of society. And that's because the pseudo-environment is a hybrid compound of human nature and conditions. So again, it's kind of useless to think about what man is and always will be from what we observe them to be doing in this moment right now. The way in which the world is imagined determines at any particular moment what men will do. It does not determine what they will achieve. It determines their effort, their feelings, their hopes, not their accomplishments and results. But what is propaganda, if not the effort to alter the picture to which men respond, to substitute one social pattern for another? What is class consciousness but a way of realizing the world? And then he talks about to explain social life as the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. That's a very Platonic, as in Plato. That's definitely coming from Plato. Okay, and then this last part I found really interesting. is this difference between, okay, the psychoanalyst, on the other hand, almost always assumes that the environment is knowable, and if not knowable, then at least bearable to any unclouded intelligence. This assumption of his is the problem of public opinion. Instead of taking for granted an environment that is readily known, the social analyst is most concerned in studying how the larger political environment is conceived and then how it can be conceived more successfully. The psychoanalyst examines the adjustment to an X called by him the environment. The social analyst examines the X called by him the pseudo-environment. So, there's more I could say to that. I have to go to the bathroom really bad, so I can't. They are saying, in effect, either that society is the sort of thing which corresponds to their idea of what is normal, or the sort of thing which corresponds to their idea of what is free. Both ideas are merely public opinions, and while the psychoanalyst, as physician, may perhaps assume them, the sociologist may not take the products of existing public opinion as criteria by which to study the public opinion. Just a quick note on this is, it seems that the social analyst, he's critiquing social analysts, which would be like social, sociologists today, because they are assessing, decisions or human nature based on a pseudo environment, the current world around. I think that's why things seem so crazy right now, is because the social analysts have kind of sunk their fangs into our public opinion. And then gets into what this book will be about. In the chapters which will follow, inquire first into some of the reasons why the picture inside so often misleads men in their dealings with the world outside. Under this heading, we shall consider first the chief factors which limit their access to the facts. They are artificial censorships, the limitations of social contact, the comparatively meager time available in each day for paying attention to public affairs, the distortion arising because events have to be compressed into very short messages, the difficulty of making a small vocabulary express a complicated world, and finally, the fear of facing those facts which would seem to threaten the established routine of men's lives. That got me super pumped, because it's so many of the things that I'm really interested in. I want to particularly call out the comparatively meager time available in each day for paying attention to public affairs is one that I think is a massive issue for people today. And then, all of these are probably equally important, but that, and then paired with compressed into, these events compressed into short messages, huge issue today. The analysis then turns from these more or less external limitations to the question of how this trickle of messages from the outside is affected by the stored up images, the preconceptions and prejudices which fill them out, and in their turn powerfully direct the play of our attention and our vision itself. From this, it proceeds to examine how in the individual person, the limited messages from outside formed into a pattern of stereotypes are identified with his own interests as he feels and conceives them. In succeeding sections, it examines how opinions are crystallized into what is called public opinion, how a national will, a group mind, groupthink, a social purpose, or whatever you choose to call it, is formed.